Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. I will present some work here where I and colleagues from the project Plantfish in Sweden have studied the causes and consequences of the massive increase of three-spine stickleback in the Baltic Sea. I'd like to emphasize that many persons have been involved in the making of these studies, particularly the people within the Plantfish project team that you see here, but also that many more have helped out with actually collecting a lot of the data that we've been utilizing. So in my research, I'm broadly focusing on understanding how ecosystems grow, change, and persist. And this includes understanding why and how ecosystems sometimes undergo rapid, large-scale and long-term changes in their structure, processes, and feedbacks, so-called regime shifts. Now, the offshore ecosystem in the Baltic Sea is well known to over the last century have shifted from dominance first of seals, then to cod, and then more lately to herring and sprat in response to changes in fishing pressure, eutrophication, and climate variability. Along the Swedish Baltic Sea coastline, we have since the 1990s seen failing recruitment of large predator fish, primarily perch and pike. But more lately, we've also seen decreases in adult pike and local declines in adult perch. In terms of smaller fish, we instead see dramatic increase in abundances of the three-spine stickleback, hereafter referred to as stickleback. Stickleback abundance in offshore areas has increased to levels up to 45 times greater than in the early 1980s. And during summers, when the stickleback migrate into shallow coastal bays along the Swedish archipelago coast to breed, they today dominate the shallow fish assemblages in a lot of areas. To better understand the causes and consequences of the stickleback increase, we conducted an intense field survey of food webs in 32 shallow coastal bays along the central Swedish coastline in 2014. The results supported the idea that in areas where perch and pike are still abundant, they can effectively suppress the stickleback numbers. However, in areas where perch and pike are naturally less abundant or have declined, stickleback are released from top-down control and instead suppress inverted grazers, which in turn benefits filamentous algae, a clear trophic cascade. In an ongoing project right now, we're now also exploring if altered competition or predation for large predator fish in offshore areas like cod, herring, and sprat, as well as the rapid warming and essential eutrophication in the Baltic Sea, has helped pave the way for the rise of the stickleback. The stickleback are generalists who primarily feed on zooplankton and benthic invertebrates when they're found along the coast. However, they also eat fish eggs and fish larvae, including those from their main predators, perch and pike. And several recent studies have demonstrated that the resulting predator-prey role reversal can strongly suppress perch and pike recruitment at local scales. And this is a type of knowledge that has been around for at least a century, as evident by this newspaper quote from 1898. Combined with the dramatic increase in stickleback, strong predator-prey reversal opens up for the possibility of a shift between two stable states or regimes in coastal fish assemblages. A first state dominated by large predator fish and a new state dominated by stickleback, which would accelerate the decline of large predator populations and suppress their population recovery. If predator-prey reversal is strong enough, we would expect fish assemblages to be dominated by either perch and pike or stickleback, but rarely be mixed, so-called bimodality. Moreover, because stickleback historically recruited mostly in the outer archipelago and the large predators mostly in the inner and middle archipelago, we would also expect a bimodal middle archipelago zone with either stickleback or perch and pike dominated areas. However, as stickleback abundance has gradually increased and large predator abundance has decreased, we would expect stickleback dominance to gradually spread inwards at the expense of perch and pike dominance, a spatial regime shift. To test this prediction of a large-scale coastal regime shift over both time and space, we compiled data from the majority of juvenile fish surveys, which have been conducted all along the Swedish Baltic Sea coast since the late 1970s. And the resulting dataset included more than 13,000 samplings in 486 bays spread across the 1,200-kilometer coastline that were sampled over nearly 4 decades. Here we first see a frequency histogram of relative predator dominance for each of the 833 bay years. So this is an index where 1 means a bay is completely perch and pike dominated, and 0 is that it's completely stickleback dominated. And as we can clearly see here, the assemblages are clearly dominated by either perch or pike or by stickleback, as predicted by the theory of a regime shift. Second, we tested how relative predator dominance, which corresponds here to the likelihood of local perch and pike or stickleback dominance, varied over time and space. And here we first see the influence of distance to offshore areas during 3 time points, the first one in 1996. As clear, there's a spatial gradient from a high likelihood of stickleback dominance, so low values, near the offshore areas, to more or less complete perch and pike dominance far from offshore areas, far into the archipelago close to the mainland coast. However, as time progresses, the likelihood of stickleback dominance has gradually moved towards the coast, as evident by the increasing distance of the 50% likelihood threshold, this red line, from 8 kilometers in 1996 to 21 kilometers from offshore areas in 2014. If we instead show the effect of time on the x-axis, which is a more common way of looking for regime shifts in time series, we see that in the outer archipelago, close to offshore areas, local perch and pike or stickleback dominance were more or less as likely as each other in the 1980s, but that over time more and more bays then became stickleback dominated. In the middle archipelago, most bays were perch and pike dominated in the 80s, but have since the 90s increasingly shifted towards stickleback dominance. And now even in the inner archipelago, far from offshore areas, we're now seeing that bays are increasingly starting to become stickleback dominated. A key question here that arises is whether predator-prey interactions, including predator-prey reversal, are strong enough to generate this spatial and temporal bistability. And to test this, we sampled both adult and juvenile fish in the 32 shallow coastal bays during both spring and summer of 2014. We then used path analysis to tease apart the direct and indirect drivers of perch, pike, and stickleback recruitment. We see that the best fitting models strongly support that predator-prey interactions in general and predator-prey reversal in particular strongly affects fish recruitment and population development. A high local abundance of adult perch and pike in spring suppresses adult stickleback, but also indirectly suppresses stickleback spawning and recruitment later in summer. However, a high local abundance of adult stickleback in spring instead suppresses perch and pike recruitment in summer, a path supported by previous experiments and field surveys, and that was needed for these models to fit the data all in all. So we find clear support here for predator-prey reversal. Summarizing here, our results support the idea of a large-scale, long-term spatial regime shift from perch and pike to stickleback dominance that you, as in this animation, can see gradually sweep towards the mainland coast and Stockholm city like a stickleback wave.